Welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee, to our first evidence session in 25 years since the Scotland Act. And I think you could sense the excitement in this committee that we're actually pursuing this as an inquiry. And to start things off, we couldn't have three venerable veterans of the early days of the Scotland Act. We asked them to leave their ermine robes at the door because it's a trio of their lordships, but we're thrilled to have you this morning to help us with this inquiry and kick things off. We'll let you introduce yourselves, and maybe just, if you have got a short introductory statement, with the emphasis being on short, so that I know that Lord Robertson will supply us with that. Please.
Thank you. Well, my name is George Robertson, and I was the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland from 1993 to 1997, and therefore supervised over the progress towards an eventual devolution agreement. At that time, the Scottish Constitutional Convention was operating, which included four Scottish political parties, the Scottish churches, trade unions, local councils, and many wide variety of civic groups. It did not include the Conservative Party and the Scottish National Party, who both refused to participate, the SNP, on the basis that we were not willing to include the possibility of independence in that. Although ultimately the then leader of the SNP agreed to promote the outcome of the Scottish Constitutional Convention. That was, without any doubt, the widest ever level of agreement in Scotland on a scheme for devolved government. I can tell you, and Lord Wallace will agree with me, it was not an easy task to get an agreement in that disparate group of people at all, but I managed to get it adopted by the National Labour Party, unusually because it was the only part of the 1997 manifesto that was not determined through the normal processes and was agreed in total, because I made it clear that it was a package that we had negotiated in Scotland and therefore had to be taken in toto. And that was quite unique in the Labour Party's 1997 manifesto. So the Constitutional Convention's output then became the basis for the Scotland Act. I was also responsible in part for the decision to have a pre-legislative referendum, which we announced to Lord Wallace's surprise, and indeed the surprise of many other people in Scotland. Was announced in advance of the Labour Party's manifesto being put to all of its members for endorsement. The timing was decided by the then party leader, Tony Blair, on the basis that we could not put the draft manifesto to the party members without saying what we were going to do about devolution. And therefore, to have done that, and then only later on said we would have a pre-legislative referendum, would have been, at best, dishonest. Therefore, the decision was taken very quickly to announce the fact that we were going to have that referendum. If I could just say, because I think it's quite important in terms of anchoring the devolution settlement, why it was we believed that we had to have a pre-legislative referendum. Why we did it by surprise, I think, is not a mystery, because it's like devaluation. If you leak it in advance, it has dramatic consequences. But the reason was, it became increasingly obvious to those of us in Scotland that if there was a very small majority, and we believed at that time that we might only squeak back, then this was a huge project that could easily be bogged down in the House of Commons and almost certainly in the House of Lords. I had experience during Maastricht of what the House of Lords can do, but the House of Commons itself, coming almost by surprise to a lot of new Labour MPs, might well have produced a lot of problems in that respect, and therefore having a pre-legislative referendum made absolute sense, because then that would give at least some grounding for the legislation. I believe it also grounded the Scottish Parliament in a way that could not have been done without having had a referendum in advance. And the 74% yes vote in the referendum gave an anchor point for devolution, so that it was inconceivable that any future government of any complexion would have unwound the devolution settlement.
And thank you for that, and that's really, really important. I think as for the opening remarks of this inquiry, it's important that you set out just how the convention worked. And so we have to come to Lord Wallace following that. And did you feel you were bounced into the referendum then? Is that was your experience of the...
We certainly did. And I think George and I exchanged words at the time. So secret was
give us a flavour of what they were
So secret was it that I actually was told the night before, because I think Tony Blair had told Paddy Ashdown, who in turn told me, and I think I found George in a lobby just before Parliament rose that night, and he was very embarrassed that I'd already found out. But probably not as embarrassed, but I then told the Labour Party's Scottish Constitution spokesman, John McCallion, the following morning as he was arriving. I said, "What are you guys doing with this referendum?" And he said, "What referendum?" And I think he resigned later that day, his position. I think the principal reason why, two reasons I think why I was not happy was, firstly, we had this debate interminably within the Constitutional Convention and agreed that there should not be a referendum. We may even have argued for it during the Constitutional Convention and lost the argument, and then for it to turn it around afterwards. And secondly, I think there was a suspicion that the Labour Party would quite like to slip out of because it was a double referendum. It was both on the principle of the Parliament and also on the tax varying powers, that they were wanting actually to find a way of actually slipping out of the commitment to the tax varying powers. I think in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, George was right. It did actually ground the Parliament when it was established. I mean, we know that the constitutional propriety is that one Parliament can't bind another, but the fact that that referendum was there, I think, has politically made it impossible for that to be reversed without another referendum to reverse the Scotland Act. So, I mean, I think in that sense it grounded, and George's point too about the House of Lords is probably right, because I think that was quite an important argument which ministers in the Lords deployed, was that it actually had popular consent. So these were the reasons why we were not happy. But when Parliament passed the referendum bill, we played our full part in that referendum campaign, and we were quite intent on getting a good majority for it, which indeed which we did. I also think it is to the credit of the incoming Labour government in '97 that it implemented the Constitutional Convention proposals, including the system of proportional representation.
I mean, I think for all of us that were starting our political journeys around that period, just how detailed the white paper was initially, and then the Scotland Bill as was that always the intention, that you propose and prepare a piece of legislation that practically covered all facets and aspects of the devolved settlement, and with all the various schedules, etc., there did seem to be an extraordinary exercise in trying to cover every aspect of the constitutional settlement at that point.
I think it's fair to say the Constitutional Convention was quite detailed, and I was just about to say, I think it's to the Labour Party's credit that in government they actually implemented not just the spirit, but to a large part the letter of it. In fact, I remember, because I was leading for the Liberal Democrats. Indeed, we were the largest Scottish party in opposition at that time. And I remember Donald asking me to discuss the white paper, the white paper before it was published. And he said, we're changing something from the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention had recommended that everything should be reserved except what was expressly devolved.
That was changed.
And Donald said, we're going to change that.
That was Donald Dewar's idea, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it certainly came within government. We had argued for that in the Constitutional Convention and lost the argument. So when he was telling me this, that was actually coming some way to some of the arguments we'd put forward. So, I mean, I was delighted to accept that. But I think the white paper quite faithfully reflected the Constitutional Convention agreement, including the system of proportional representation, which, it's not very often in political history that a party gives up what might at that time have been perceived as an opportunity to have an overall majority if they'd opted for first past the post, but they didn't. They stuck with the agreement, and we were happy to. We always had lots of debates during the passage of the Scotland Bill. Some very good debates, but by and large, we were satisfied and content that what we had agreed in the convention. And George is right; there were some difficult times, as we both will well remember. But this stuck to the overall shape of what we had agreed, and we were quite happy to give it support.
I'll come to you in a minute, Andrew, because I'm interested in your views about the early devolution, but just now we've got these two gentlemen reflecting on what happened 25 years ago. I mean, what we look at specifically in this inquiry, and where you can maybe help us with, is the intergovernmental machinery, how intergovernmental relations have worked since the Scotland Act, as it was, came into force in the Parliament. I'm just wondering, when you look back 25 years, was there enough work done on the intergovernmental relations side of the Scotland Bill? Was what you proposed for the machinery in intergovernmental relations robust to sustain its way through 25 years of different governments, different politics being played out, probably every few years? Just tell us what you think, where we are just now in intergovernmental relations and what you proposed.
Well, remember my involvement, my detailed involvement with the devolution settlement sort of ended on the 3rd of May 1997, because I became the Secretary of State for Defence. A lot of people claimed that was demotion. And occasionally I had to sort of go along with this mythology at the time, such as the parochialism in Scotland as a whole. But in the lead up to to the election, there was certainly a view that devolution had to be seen in the context of enriching the United Kingdom. That it wasn't to be seen solely and simply as being a method of making the Scottish office more accountable, although that was one of the big arguments that was obviously being used. And I think, Donald Dewar, in his original statements made it clear that this was a revitalisation of the United Kingdom. I think maybe once the referendum had passed, once the legislation was through, and once the Parliament was created, there was a bit of a sense nationally, UK nationally, that let them get on with it. Let the devolved administrations in Cardiff and in Belfast and in Edinburgh just get on with it, and let us deal with the things that are reserved to Westminster. Now, in the lead up to the election, we saw the devolution settlement as being part and parcel of the way the United Kingdom was actually going to be run. And I think that was missing. My view certainly at the time was that we would see the ministers in the devolved administrations being part and parcel of the government of the UK on a regular and a consistent basis. But that wasn't necessarily the view of London as a whole.
Of course, you famously told us that devolution would kill independence stone dead. I'm just wondering if that's still your view, that devolution did achieve that objective that you set.
If I could say, Mr. Chairman, respectfully to you, I have yet to be proved wrong. And the way things are going at the present moment, you can prophesy that. I anticipated I was going to get the stone dead.
It's taken so long, actually. So.
I know it took quite a long time to come to it. We will see. We will see. It wasn't a prophecy that was designed at that precise moment to say it was going to happen instantaneously.
Maybe it's a point to bring Lord Dunlop in. And I mean, I don't know how much you were involved in the early days.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm not sure I can remember what I was doing in 1998 or 1999, but unlike these two gentlemen, I wasn't involved actively in politics at that stage. But as you know, I was invited by Theresa May to undertake a sort of review of UK government union capability and looked at intergovernmental relations. And while I was doing that, I obviously interviewed people from that period to try and get underneath, what was going on at that stage. And I suppose the conclusion I came to was that there was an assumption when, the devolution settlements were established, that these would be consensual relationships. And, it was clear that because you had Labour-led governments in Edinburgh, Cardiff and London, that there was a tendency to use informal party channels more than the structures that had been laid down at the time the Scottish Parliament was set up. And I think probably it was a great shock to the system in 2007 when you had the election of the minority SNP government, because suddenly you had two governments that, instead of being collaborative, were in competition with each other. And I think the structures that had been anticipated had probably over time atrophied, and by the time 2007 came along, probably they had become into sort of disrepair and weren't fit for purpose at that stage.
This is before I pass on to Christine Jardine, who I'm sure will have several questions for Lord Wallace. I'd just like to ask you, Lord Wallace, given your experience in all this, early days of the Constitutional Convention through the Scotland Bill, yourself, of course, becoming Deputy First Minister and First Minister for a while, is it roughly worked out how you expected 25 years later, sitting in front of the Scottish Affairs Committee talking about it? Is when you set out on this journey, did you think we'd roughly be at this point that we are just now?
No, I didn't. But so many things can happen in 25 years. But go back to the question before. Was there much thought about intergovernmental relations? I don't think there was. In terms of, I don't think there was in terms of formal structures. I recall that there was meant to be a meeting on a monthly basis between the Secretary of State and the Scottish First Minister. I recall Donald telling me about meeting with John Reid once or twice, but I don't think it ever became properly established. Certainly during the period when I was acting First Minister, I never had that sort of kind of formal meeting with the Secretary of State. But I think a lot of it was down to personalities and relationships. And by and large, it works. But I do remember probably, Donald saying to me quite early on that he foresaw this problem down the track when people didn't know each other quite so well. I mean, although I was a Liberal Democrat, I mean, I had been around the House of Commons long enough to know a lot of people who were in government, in the Labour government in Westminster. And most of my departmental engagement with Westminster was done on a departmental level. I mean, when I was the Justice Minister in Scotland, I dealt with Jack Straw and occasionally, depending on the subject, with the Lord Chancellor, Lord Irvine. And very rarely did we go through the Secretary of State for Scotland. It was done, and likewise, subsequently, when I was Enterprise and Lifelong Learning Minister, I had relations, particularly in higher education, with Charles Clarke and Alan Johnson, who was the deputy. And we didn't always agree, but we had an agreement of no surprises, and that was that sort of relationship. But I think Donald certainly was quite conscious that these relationships over time would not break down. These relationships were okay, but there was people coming up in both our parties, both sides, both in Scotland and in Westminster, who didn't have that kind of knowledge and relationship of each other. And I recall a British-Irish Council meeting, I think it was in the Isle of Man, where I was being accompanied by Andy Kerr, who at the time was either the Health Minister or the Finance Minister in Scotland. And he was a Labour Minister in the coalition. And I had to introduce him to John Prescott, because they didn't know each other. And it struck me then, these relationships, which had held us in good stead, were actually fraying, and not through any ill will or anything like that, just by the passage of time. And if that was important for us as ministers, I think it was also important for for officials, because I think there was quite a lot of secondments, which was always very useful, and that over time, I think people didn't know each other, didn't know their opposite numbers quite so well.
Well, maybe come back to what you think where we are 25 years later in a minute, but I know, Wendy, you have to go at 5:30, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So, if you want to ask your question.
I think just bringing it forward 25 years and on that point, Lord Wallace, That's certainly been my impression as a 2019 intake MP, that building relationships on a cross-party basis has been more challenging because of COVID. And I suppose just in terms of COVID, what do you think the COVID impact has been on relationships as we look back those 25 years? Lord Robertson, if I can come to you.
Well, as I say, I'm not as intimately connected, but I sat on a House of Lords Select Committee where one of these annual ones, they last for a year, on risk management and risk assessment. And it was quite intriguing during the course of that Select Committee, whose recommendations, all but one, were accepted by the government. Quite eye-opening. There were two former Defence Secretaries on that committee, and we were quite startled by what we found. In 2016, there was a full-scale national, i.e. UK, exercise, Operation Cepheus, based on a pandemic. It was a flu pandemic at that time. It's still on the internet. It's still worth reading because you can see there what was involved in it. And one of the things that our committee came out with was the absolute essential nature of there being the devolved administrations involved in any future pandemic or any other risk assessment that was going to be necessary, and not just on a sort of, add-on, but absolutely part and parcel of it. And the way the Constitution has changed in this country now means that without some form of sort of established statutory mechanism, then the informal connections that previously worked don't automatically work in the future. And I think COVID has highlighted, what our committee actually said about how these things should be dealt with in the future.
And particularly around those decision-making that we know, as we see with the COVID inquiry progressing, were difficult.
Well, it's going to be intriguing, to see the outcome of both the UK one and the Scottish one, and see what lessons can be drawn. At the moment, we're involved in the sort of personalities, but and that's controversial enough. But going beyond it, I think there need to be lessons learned.
Lord Dunlop.
I mean, I would make a couple of points. I mean, I think it's clear from looking, over the course of the COVID pandemic, that the kind of relationships and decision-making with the devolved governments sort of ebbed and flowed. At the start, they were part of the COBRA system, and we might go into, why that changed. And I think in the summer, the way it all worked was different, and I think we began to see some of that tension coming out. I think later on, we then had Michael Gove getting more of a grip of the intergovernmental relations, and some good joint working, planning for Christmas, all of that kind of thing. I think the other point I would make is if you look at some of the Whitehall departments that were critical during the COVID pandemic, the Department of Health, Department of Education, I can't remember what it was called at the time, but what is now levelling up.
Communities.
Communities,
like
yes. I mean, they were departments that probably hadn't been much exposed to the devolved government. So they had a very steep learning curve, and I think probably that did show during COVID. But I mean, I think the good point is, they now know a hell of a lot more about devolved government than they did before. So hopefully that will serve us well in the future.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, Lord Wallace?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only really go by what I saw on TV and read in the newspapers. I had no insight from what was going on in either Holyrood or in Whitehall. But the impression I had was, as I think Andrew used the phrase, ebbed and flowed. Yes. There were times it did look as if there was some reasonable joined-up decision-making. Other times it looked there was difference for the sake of difference.
And do you think it exacerbated that sort of fraying that you said that Donald Dewar described?
I think it probably was the case that when the crisis came, there wasn't that level of understanding, there wasn't that level of mutual trust. I think trust is important. And I suspect that mutual trust was not there at a time when it was needed. And Andrew's a very perceptive point that the departments which were most important are probably the ones which had the least connection with what had been going on in Scotland: health, education, and communities and housing, I think. So I mean, there was quite a lot of, there was a steep learning curve, and I hope at the end of the day there was a better understanding, and I think it's maybe one of the issues you want to look at as part of it. It's just what,
and potentially the role of the Scotland office
and
in
the role of the
helping
Scotland office
bring those departments
facilitate it.
potentially more up to speed,
That's right.
being effective in
I still think the question of secondments, how the extent does that happen or not happen these days, and also education. To what extent do UK departments or English departments in the UK government understand? And understand that there are differences too, which are sometimes, certainly my experience as Advocate General for Scotland was that they had to be reminded from time to time.
This is with good reason. Thank you very much,
Yeah, can I just make a little point here? It may sound tangential, but my experience in NATO, I think is in many ways relevant. NATO was set up in 1949 essentially to stop Stalin's sort of dominoes falling. But it was quite ingeniously created, whereby the permanent representatives were appointed at a very high level, and they had to meet. The North Atlantic Council had to meet at an hour's notice, for any individual thing. The countries had to be represented around the table. So from 1949 up until now, every security issue affecting the Euro-Atlantic area was resolved because essentially the countries were round a table all the time. So anything that came up had to be dealt with. You couldn't really leave the table without some agreement being there. So there was a sort of binding necessity for people to come to some sort of consensual agreement. And that seems to me, from my experience looking now at the devolved administrations, that if there was some mechanism whereby people were obliged, to sit round a table and to deal with the issues, then even competing governments can come to an agreement. The countries, my day, 19 countries were around the table, and they did not all agree on everything. They had 19 different populations, 19 different politics, and sometimes the arguments could be quite intense, but at the end of the day you got a consensus agreement. You had to get a consensus agreement, and that's not a bad example to show how the myriad of relationships involved in the United Kingdom might actually be better organised.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is almost a surreal experience for me. Given my experience in government with Lord Dunlop and the Scotland office. But going back to what you were saying about the relationships between the governments, Professor Jim Gallagher has described that intergovernmental relationship machinery as being more technocratic than anything else. And you've all touched on that, the importance of personal relationships and trust. So with the benefit of hindsight, do you think the way that the relationship developed between 1999 and 2022 is what you would have anticipated in, say, the Constitutional Convention or in the immediate aftermath of the referendum? And how resilient do you think it actually was?
George might have a different view from the Constitutional Convention, I'm not sure I don't think we ever actually did anticipate what these mechanisms would be in terms of intergovernmental. And I think a lot of it was down to almost an expectation that there would be enough personalities on both sides that would make it, that wanted to make it work and would make it work. And the longer term thinking, what happens when these personalities change, let alone when the parties in government change, wasn't probably given sufficient consideration. The only really sort of formal mechanism or formal structure that there was the Joint Ministerial Council of the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, the First and Deputy First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I remember the first one we held in Victoria Quay in Edinburgh, and it was very exciting. Because it was the first time it had happened, but actually nothing much happened at the meeting. And the second one we held in Cardiff was much the same. Rodri Morgan always had some grouse about the DTI, which I can't now remember what it was, but there was some. And by the time we came to the third one, I think I said when I gave evidence to this committee back in 2019, the time we came to the third one, held in 10 Downing Street, it was, Tony Blair spent, I think, from memory, a disproportionate amount of time looking out the window, because nothing much was happening. Other things were happening in a ministerial level, but actually the one is a formal structure that was there, and we never held another JMC at that level until Alex Salmond and David Cameron, I think it would be, has reinstituted it. There were other efforts at departmental ministerial meetings. I remember one on health. It must have been during Donald Duer's illness, because I was there as the acting First Minister along with Susan Deakin, who was the Health Minister in number 10, and the health ministers from each of the devolved nations were there with the Prime Minister in the chair and the Health Secretary. And that was actually very useful. In doing actually what I would always thought perhaps one of the things that devolution should do was each country could, all relatively similar problems, but each of the devolved administrations in the UK government saying how they were dealing with it. And there was things to be learned from each other and things not to do, possibly as well as things to do. And that was a useful meeting. There was others we held once and never held again. There was ones, I think, on welfare, I remember happening. But another level too, ones where there's important intergovernmental work was agriculture and fisheries. And I know that my colleague Ross Finney, before every Fisheries Council and before Agriculture Ministers' Councils, because the EU was a platform or a forum where it was important that the devolved administrations fed in. And there was a lot, and there was foot and mouth as well. And there was a lot of intergovernmental, both at official level and at ministerial level of discussion, and I think for the most part getting things done. And one problem I remember Ross raising or saying was that the Secretary of State was a important key figure. He said there were at least one or two Secretaries of State at DEFRA who got it and recognised that the UK position would not necessarily the English position. And one of the other ministerial people from DEFRA, maybe the Minister of State or the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, would represent the English position, and the Secretary of State, as it were, held the ring. Whereas other Secretaries of State couldn't understand why the English position could not possibly be the United Kingdom position. Surely it was self-evident, and he said that changed the dynamic of it. So I think there is a problem sometimes too when the UK minister, if the UK minister is in, he or she is in the chair, has got to remember that the UK position in these were days when we were in the EU, but it still, I suspect, applies in particular in areas like agriculture and fisheries, where the English position isn't, I suspect, even within England. The difference between the fishing interests of the northeast and the fishing interests of Cornwall could be very different, and I think it's important that is borne in mind.
Thank you. Lord Robertson, has it developed and had been as resilient as you would have hoped?
I don't think we paid enough attention in the convention and in the planning for the settlement to what was going to happen in terms of the relationship. It was hard enough to get an agreement on the bones of the devolution agreement. So I don't think we really spent much time at all thinking through what the implications were going to be beyond it. Before the '97 election, we were the Labour Party front bench were sent to Templeton College, Oxford, for training to be ministers. 4 half days. The totality of my lifetime, sort of learning experience was in the 4 days there, and a lot of it was actually quite useful. I remember one particular lesson in particular, where one former permanent secretary said, "Set achievable objectives and achieve them," which I always thought was self-evident, but not exactly the model to do with that. But at that session, a lot of my English colleagues were confronted for the very first time with what the Scottish Constitutional Convention was actually proposing. And it was radical, and it was difficult for them, to sort of grasp the fact that the United Kingdom was going to be a very different place, and that their job, if they achieved ministerial positions, was going to be different from that they had expected, or in some cases had experienced themselves. So we probably didn't do enough. So I've been a bit more worried now about the way things have developed. And I think we were probably too optimistic, too much wishful thinking, because, we've seen it develop now in a way, the committee structure that we thought was going to be essentially the equivalent of a second chamber, because it would give the scrutiny, has not worked out that way because, one party took ownership of the committee systems and neutralised it. We didn't foresee the degree of centralisation that there was likely to be in Edinburgh, that devolution was devolved to Scotland, but not necessarily to the various parts of Scotland, And we foresaw the fact that the Scottish Parliament was going to be a discussion forum about some of the great issues that confronted the country, only to find that the plenary sessions in the Scottish Parliament are now highly limited and very small indeed, and that the executive has now become the major driving force rather than the Parliament itself.
I wonder if we could move on now 10 years, if my maths is any good, to the election of the SNP-led Scottish Government in 2007. Did it change the nature, or it must have changed the nature? To what extent do you think it changed the nature of the relations between Westminster and Holyrood? If we could come to Lord Lawless first of all.
Yeah, certainly between 2007 and 2010, I was on the outside. I left the Scottish Parliament before the minority SNP government was elected. I was in the House of Lords from November 2007. But I think it did. It was always going to be a challenge when it wasn't the same, even if relationships on personal knowledge of Labour, Lib Dem coalition members and Labour government members over time had become less familiar. I think another party made it changed the dynamic, but I don't remember being over fractious. I think it was just a consciousness that maybe had to be worked at harder. And I think certainly, I can't remember whether it was when David Cameron became Prime Minister, or whether it was even before that the idea was mooted of actually revamping what had been the Joint Ministerial Committee. And then there was the overarching one of First Minister, Prime Minister level, and then there was one domestic and there was one Europe. Now I think Joint Ministerial Committee for Europe probably had gone on for quite a long time, even up to that. And it was I used to claim I was one of the few people that actually served on that committee on both sides, with the UK government and the Scottish government, and I'm not quite sure which was the more exciting. But it was a good place for issues, particularly upcoming European councils, for these issues to be discussed. And I think that certainly did continue post 2007. But I think it was probably both 2011 where it was put on a more firm footing. Again, one always has been totally cynical that both sides had the press release written before the meeting took place. Whether that's true or not, it felt like that, or it seemed like that. But it was important that happened, and I think things did try and progress from there. I mean, although ironically it was one of the biggest divisions between the Westminster government and the Holyrood government was the referendum in 2014, getting to that referendum actually involved quite a lot of negotiation to get the Edinburgh Agreement, and actually, a lot of hard work at both at ministerial level and official level to get that done. So it was slightly irony that the issue that was most divisive was the one which, in many respects, actually made people had to work together to get it, to get a deliverable.
Anecdotally, I remember intergovernmental relations working at its best in the lead up to the Edinburgh Agreement and that period after it. There was more engagement, there was more of a respect. It was going between two governments at that point that I've ever seen as a member of
And of course, alongside that was what became the 2012 Scotland Act, and that also required quite a lot of discussion and negotiation.
How effective do you think then David Cameron's Respect agenda was in fostering good relations? Did it foster good relations? Apart from the referendum, did it foster good relations between the two governments? Or was there this kind of, we're working towards a referendum but nothing else?
Shall I
You were
answer that? I think when David Cameron, I joined him at the beginning of 2012, so the starting pistol had already been fired on the referendum, and it was about, how do you agree the rules of that referendum? And I think, David Cameron's approach was to try and re-energise some of the formal processes. But I think, the theme that's come out so far is very much what his approach to it was, to try and make sure that despite, big political differences, you could establish a good professional sort of working relationship. And I think, this constant theme, it's about building those relationships. And certainly from what I could see, he had a good working relationship with both the First Ministers that he worked with. And I think you saw that in the delivery of the Edinburgh Agreement. There was always the option of legislating in Westminster, but I think, the government was absolutely determined, for reasons of legitimising any result of a referendum, that it should be a referendum that was, and you will remember the phrase, made in Scotland. And, so very little was put into the Section 30 order in terms of specifying what those rules should be. I think there were only two, really. A single question, and the referendum had to be held by a certain date. The rest was put into that political agreement. So that involved, a lot of trust on both sides, that when the Scottish Parliament came to legislate, that it would adhere to the features that had been negotiated in that agreement. So I think that was the approach, but I don't think it was just limited to the Edinburgh Agreement. I think, as Jim has already said, there was the 2012 Scotland Act. We then went on to implementing the Smith Commission and the 2016 Act. There was the fiscal framework, which was not an easy thing to get done. And then we initiated, a huge and significant program, in my view, of city and growth deals. And all of that required, intensive working with opposite numbers in the Scottish Government. And I think David Cameron encouraged that, not just the political leaders, but, through civil service. I, as a political advisor in those days, I saw it as part of my job to get to know my opposite numbers in the Scottish Government, so that you could have that frank discussion before the rather, formal, formulaic, and I agree with Jim. I don't think the JMCs were great meetings. I sat in on many of them, and it was people reading from scripts. And it was more, what happened in the margins, the bilaterals that took place, that really was critical to getting those relationships built.
One last thing I wonder about, that it was all very positive, the relationship at that point, the intergovernmental relationship over the Constitution, because, if you like, both governments had an interest in ensuring that the constitutional issue was settled in whichever way. But that has changed to a certain extent now. So how would you, each of you, view the coalition government's approach to intergovernmental relations in comparison to the current UK government? Is it more or less, you think? Is it smoother? Is it more confrontational? Is it less confrontational?
Well, I think the preamble to your question was that, that the coalition government was dealing with this against a background of a referendum that was looming, and the necessity of getting these things done. The post-coalition Conservative government, one big major thing was Brexit, and Brexit threw up all the kind of problems which no one had really, certainly we never anticipated back in the Constitutional Convention. But it did actually, the EU withdrawal bill, I remember spending hours in the House of Lords on that. And I mean, I think at the outset of that bill, what appeared was that everything that was returning from Brussels was to be reserved unless they were then expressly devolved, which of course totally stood the original settlement on its head. But I think that was then, during passage of the bill and during negotiation, was what was changed. But it did actually, and it led to Andrew having to do lots of work on common frameworks and the subsequent response to that. So I think that in itself was a catalyst, but let's say it put a strain on the system which was unexpected and for which the system was not really prepared.
Very Lord and Lop.
I mean, sorry.
I'm just very conscious of time, gentlemen, because I know we've got a couple of other guests to see us, and we're only about halfway through, but we're going to extend the session, so there's no rush for it. For everybody, but just to...
Yeah, I mean, I think in the kind of spring in 2016, after the fiscal framework was agreed, I mean, I think, you know, there was a chance at that point that we were entering into a sort of calmer period of relations between the two governments. And then, I mean, I agree with Jim. I think, you know, Brexit sort of put that off track. And I think the point I would make is intergovernmental relations can help. But where there are fundamental political disagreements, you know, the most robust, the best intergovernmental relations machinery in the world is not going to resolve that. And, you know, I think some of the evidence you've received, I think, reflects that. You know, I think, quoting from memory, one of them says we mustn't be starry-eyed about it. So I think what you're talking about in this inquiry can help, but it won't remove fundamental political differences.
Thank you. Lord Robertson, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think I've got much to add to that. Experience, so
we'll move on. Just very conscious of time. Douglas first.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. Lord Dunlop, can I perhaps start with you, given today's cabinet reshuffle, and you worked for the former Prime Minister, now the current Foreign Secretary. You came in 2012, I think you said, and we have today published evidence from David Cameron, who responded to our inquiry when he was still a former Prime Minister rather than a government minister. But what was the situation like in Number 10 at that time, 2 years into the coalition government, something that we hadn't seen for many, many years here in the UK, with the referendum, you know, knowing that the referendum was going to happen? What was the situation like in Number 10 under Prime Minister David Cameron, and how do you feel the relations changed during his time in office while you were there from 2012 to 2016?
Well, I think, I mean...
Sorry, relations between UK and Scottish governments.
Well, I think, you know, self-evidently, you know, when you're Prime Minister, you have a lot of things to deal with. And, you know, the relationship with Scotland and the Scottish government was just one aspect of his job. But I always found that, you know, he gave a lot of attention. I think he realised the importance of it. And I think he was very sort of focused on it. And, you know, he was determined that we should get to a point where we had agreed with the Scottish government the rules of the referendum. And, you know, that wasn't easy to achieve. And your next witness, Kieran Martin, can go into this in great detail. But you know, he invested time in those relationships. So, you know, when there were these formal meetings, he would always take time to have a one-to-one. You know, no officials, even I as a political advisor, not allowed in the room. And I think that was about building those sort of personal relationships, so you could have that space where you could have a frank conversation. And I think, you know, both the First Ministers he's dealt with have both said publicly that despite big differences, you know, they felt they had a good professional working relationship with David Cameron. And I think that continued right through his period in office, as demonstrated by the things we were able to get done during that period.
I want to come on to that based on his evidence, which I think, you know, people will find interesting. One point that I'd never heard of, and maybe I've missed this, but he says in his evidence that he offered annually to go to the Scottish Parliament to be scrutinised by a committee of MSPs, but that wasn't taken up. Do you think that would be a good thing? We struggle, we've never been able to get a Scottish First Minister to appear before our committee, and indeed we have challenges at the moment with SNP ministers coming here, but I was quite taken by the fact that David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, offered to go to Holyrood,
I think that is...
And unfortunate it was never accepted?
I think it is unfortunate that it was never accepted, because I think he was determined that all, his ministers should make themselves to reasonable requests by the Scottish Parliament to appear before their committees. And he wanted to, reinforce that by making that offer to come before the Scottish Parliament and be questioned by members of the Scottish Parliament. I don't know the reasons why it was never taken up, but I think it was a good idea and perhaps something that should be thought about again.
And finally to you, Lord Dunlop, the final point that David Cameron makes is he highlights that during his time in office, one of the particular achievements for Scotland was the city and region growth deals. Now, you will have seen them both as a political advisor to the Prime Minister, but also as a minister in the Scotland office. How successful do you think they've been, given they now cover all 32 local authorities? At times they've ensured that some projects have gone ahead, but at other times they have created some friction between which government invests in which area. Do you think on the whole they've been a success and they've allowed both governments to work together, or do you think they have sometimes been used by either party to cause a debate where there really shouldn't have been?
I think overall they have been a success. I mean, if you think of the substantial sums that have been invested, all over Scotland, and I think, I feel that intergovernmental relations has sometimes been about damage limitation. How do we manage grievance? And I think the big thing about city and growth deals is actually it's something positive to work on. And I think if you're thinking about how do intergovernmental relations, and certainly my aspiration for intergovernmental relations would be, I think devolution has been a great thing, allowing different parts of the country to do different things and try different things. But it shouldn't be at the expense of coming together to work on things where there is a sort of common interest in doing so and solving common problems. And I would hope that as intergovernmental relations sort of matures and becomes embedded, that people are looking more at the opportunities rather than just simply managing the risks in the relationship.
Thank you. To Lord Robertson first and then Lord Wallace, this is a connected question, but I'd like to go to Lord Robertson first in terms of your discussions and debates in your shadow role, formulating the policy that would become the Scotland Act 1998. What areas of interest and what proportion of interest was there in terms of the role of the Lord Advocate for Scotland as someone who would go on through the Scotland Act 1998 to be the person in charge of prosecutions in Scotland, but also a government minister appointed to sit in the cabinet of the Scottish Government?
I don't really think I can help you with that at all. I don't think that was really thought of as being an issue. That was one of the sort of granular issues that was going to follow when the legislation came forward. Remember, we were looking, we were in incredible detail, but not that degree of granularity. So that's an interesting, sort of issue has obviously come up since then. But I think Lord Wallace is in a better position to say how that was developed and invented.
Thank you. Well, Lord Wallace, as someone who scrutinised the Scotland Act in your role as the lead Lib Dem spokesperson at the time, someone who has served as a Justice Minister in the Scottish Parliament and Advocate General in the UK Government, are you content with the current model of the Lord Advocate being both the head of prosecutions and investigating deaths in Scotland and a government-appointed minister who can attend cabinet?
No, I'm not, and I think I'm on the record for that. And I can't, whether I was raising that before 1998 or not, I can't remember. But you ask why it happened like that. I mean, the truth of the matter, of course, that was a position under the old pre-1990, 1999, albeit that the Lord Advocate wasn't in the cabinet, but was a member of the government and was also the head of the prosecution in Scotland. And I think I don't remember any great debate about it, but I think it was the natural thing that the historic position of the law office, the Lord Advocate, that should be the advisor to the Scottish Government. And the Scotland Act provided for the Lord Advocate and the Solicitor General, if they were not members of the Scottish Parliament already, that they should be able to sit, albeit not vote, in the Scottish Parliament. So that was almost, in some respects, a continuation of what was there before. I've certainly, and I can't remember when I actually first expressed this, I do think there is an advantage in having a split in responsibility between the prosecutorial role and arguably the one in terms of fatal accident and investigation of deaths, and the political role, because I think they are distinctive, and whilst I don't think any of the holders of the office have abused it, I think perceptions are important too, and I don't have a problem with the government's principal legal advisor being a party, having a party affiliation. But that's not necessarily a good thing if you're the head of the prosecution, because it could give the wrong impression.
We're in that situation at the moment. There is an ongoing case, which we can say what is in the public domain, where the First Minister, former First Minister, was arrested and investigated, and that will have gone at some stage through the Crown Office to the person that she appointed to the role as Lord Advocate.
I think, and I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong, I think Lord Advocate has recused herself from that, and quite properly so recused herself from it.
Someone in the Crown Office in which she runs had to sign that off. So ultimately, people who work for her are involved.
Yeah, but that is a big change, and as one I've advocated in times past. Can
I just come here? I think we have to be very careful that we're discussing live investigation.
And I haven't said anything that's not in the public domain.
Hopefully neither of us has said anything. I just want to make it clear that the present Lord Advocate, to my knowledge, has actually recused herself from that investigation. I think that's not going to change tomorrow, but I think something which should certainly be considered. But having had the experience of being a law officer in the UK government, there is the role of the lawyer very often is to be able to tell your client when they've got it that you can't do this. But if you've got a political understanding, and you can say, but actually, I know what you want to achieve, and here is the better way of doing it, which is consistent with the law. And I think you do need some sort of political insight to be able to fulfil that function as the principal advisor to the government. So I think that there is a distinction. But as you raised the point of the Lord Advocate and Advocate General, can I just put on record that my relationship as Advocate General for Scotland with the Lord Advocates who were there at the time, both Ailish Angelini and Frank Mulholland, was very constructive. And we sought, if there was issues coming up that were problematic, we sought to discuss them. And it was also, I'm not sure how well known this is, that certainly back in, it may still be the case, I don't know, but certainly when I was in office, that Scottish Government bills were shared with the officials of the Advocate General's office some 2 to 3 weeks before they were published, which allowed an opportunity, for discussion. And sometimes things were changed, taken out, because they could see coming down the track there might be a problem. Sometimes we had to deal with the problems after the legislation was published. But it was a good example of constructive working between officials and to try and minimise friction, which probably is one of the reasons why there was no case that went to the Supreme Court in about the first 20 odd years.
On that point, going back to David Cameron's evidence, he says during his period in office there were 24 LCMs and the Scottish Government giving approval to all but one, which I think shows that good working relationship.
Good work. And that went both ways.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Can I ask, finally, looking at the Scottish Parliament, 25 years on from the Scotland Act and 24 years on since the re-establishment of the Parliament, do you think, and I think some of you have already touched upon this, Lord Robertson, you were speaking about the plenary sessions that are not well attended, etc. Do you think it is working as anticipated? And Lord Dunlop, I know you weren't involved in 98 and such like, but what is your view in terms of how well it is doing with the devolved functions and also its crucial role in scrutinising the government of the day? And I'm particularly wondering about the committees. Lord Wallace, you will have appeared in front of many, both in this place and in Holyrood.
I have appeared as a UK government minister in front of a Scottish Parliament committee too. Yeah. So, I think that's why I think Lord Robertson mentioned it too. That's been one of my big disappointments of things, the way they've evolved. It's an external view. but it is actually a view that has been expressed to me by current members of the Scottish Parliament, that the committees are not functioning, I think, as many of us thought at the outset, and indeed was the reality at the outset, that the party discipline has been such that there's not much scope for dissent in the government party. Now, I contrast that when, as a minister, I used to appear before Scottish Parliament committees and got turned over mostly by people on my own side, and by that I mean Liberal Democrat MSPs in the coalition. And one example I give, and it was the run-up to the 2001 census. There was an inquiry by the Equal Opportunities Committee which wanted a religion question in the census. Now, you might think putting a question in the census actually is quite an expensive thing to do. And the view of the government, Scottish Government, was that we couldn't actually weren't quite sure what would be done with the information, so could we justify the expense? And moreover, it required primary legislation because the questions were basically set out in the 1920 Act. So if we wanted to add something as fundamental as the religion question, we had to amend the 1920 Act. And we took the view as a government that we couldn't justify that. And I appeared before the Equal Opportunities Committee, and to say that I got turned over is probably putting it mildly. And we accepted the committee. I mean, I went and I said to them, look, you've expressed your view, it was cross-party, and I brought forward the legislation. I said, one thing I would ask you was, this is how I saw the Parliament working. On a cross-party basis, you give a minister a hard time, you come to a conclusion, and we have responded to it in the spirit of your conclusion. Don't rub our noses in it, because that actually takes away from what you've actually achieved. I couldn't see that happening in the recent times.
Lord Dunlop, from your position when you were a special advisor, when you were in the Scotland office, how did you view deliberations by the Scottish Parliament?
I mean, I would sort of echo what Jim has said, but I would actually sort of quote somebody, the late Nigel Smith. I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, he ran the Yes campaign for the referendum, prior to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. So he had huge aspirations for the Scottish Parliament. And he produced, I think on the 20th anniversary, his assessment of, how the Scottish Parliament was performing. And I think in terms of the robustness of the scrutiny, of committees and such like, I think it's fair to say that while he felt that it was a great thing that the Parliament had been established, I think he was disappointed with how it had evolved.
Lord Robertson.
Yeah, I think there is a disappointment. It may have been due to over high expectations, which we helpfully raised ourselves at the time about what it was going to do. But if you make the comparison, with what went before, 4 ministers ran Scotland almost like a private fiefdom, and I've had some arguments with Michael Forsyth now, about the days that were there. But 4 ministers were running Scotland at that time, and it was pretty ferocious sort of politicking about it. So I do feel disappointment that the committee system has not been as robust, that the party discipline has been far too tight, and therefore has not allowed that, flowering of debate and discussion and the variety of views that you would normally.
Thank you for that. I'm just really conscious. I've got 3 other members who want to come in, and I want to start the next session at 20 past. So it's 5 minutes each, if everybody's all right. And we'll start with Anna Kaiser. Anna.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for joining us today, panel. I'm really keen to learn a little bit more about the state of the relations between the Scottish and the UK government. So, Lord Wallace, do you think the new machinery of intergovernment relations, which were introduced in 2022, have seen improved relations at a political level between both governments?
I'll put my hands up and admit that I've been out of the game for one reason or another, being moderator of the General Assembly and also having been quite ill for a while, that I haven't actually fully caught up with what I've actually managed to read up ahead of this committee is that I think the structure in place is better. And I think there's some suggestion that in many ways it has actually worked to some extent. I think there was a new financial agreement was struck without any of the sort of trauma that Andrew maybe had with the other one. So I think the potential is there, and I think it's a question like let's see how it works works out in practice. And if I could say one thing, which I did say, I think when I was on the Cullinan Committee and which other things, I think it probably needs to be more transparent. I mean, I made the example then. I'm not saying there should be a ministerial statement after each meeting, but at least maybe a written parliamentary answer in each of the devolved administration and in here as to what has actually taken place, for a bit more transparency. But I think probably the jury's still out.
Lord Donald, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, I think it's hugely improved, but it is work in progress. If we think back to what were the key concerns about the previous system, it was that it was something the UK government did to the devolved governments. It wasn't a sort of partnership. And I think the other point was that the engagement was sort of unpredictable and uneven. And I certainly think the review has addressed those two aspects. So you now have a secretariat, for example, that is explicitly jointly appointed and jointly owned, and can actually sort of determine, whether a dispute is a genuine dispute rather than the UK government being judge and jury. And although I think, we're in early days of all the interministerial groups, the fact that those groups exist, we talked about building relationships. The very fact that people are meeting on a more regular basis, I think is a step forward, but a long way to go. And I agree totally with what Lord Wallace has said about transparency. Very uneven quality of information. And for you people who are scrutinising this whole process, I think it's very difficult for you to get your teeth into it. How do you judge whether things are working effectively when there are no kind of objectives? Do you know what work is being commissioned by these groups or what outcomes they're expecting? And until we get to that more mature state, I think it is going to be very much work in progress.
And on the topic of meetings, it's my understanding that the Prime Minister and the heads of 12 government councils has only met once since January 2022, while some interministerial groups are still yet to be established. So what does this tell us about the approach towards intergovernment relations? And then following on from that, because I'm short of time, what mindset do you think is required going forward from both governments to ensure that intergovernment relations remain strong?
Well, I think the key for me is when Whitehall Secretaries of State, speaking from a UK government perspective, see this as an important part of their job, and they're dealing with lots of different subjects, but they should regard working with the devolved governments as an important part of what they do.
Lord Robertson, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I agree with that entirely.
Brilliant, like a short, snappy answer. Last question to all three of you, please. To what extent do you think UK government intergovernmental relations have changed since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister?
I haven't known.
Well, I said earlier about during COVID, sort of relationship ebbed and flowed, and we've had quite a number of prime ministers in recent years, and I think the relationship has ebbed and flowed with those sort of prime ministers. I didn't think it was a good thing that Liz Truss, when she became prime minister, did not pick up the phone and speak to the leaders of the devolved governments. And I think we've seen under Rishi Sunak a commitment to hold, the heads of government council, and I would expect, and I think he said he's committed to holding at least one a year. So we're in November, so he's still got a few months to go, but I'm sure he will deliver.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, gentlemen. Section 35 of the Scotland Act was used for the first time earlier this year in relation to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. And this has often been described as unprecedented. Do you think it has set a precedent for the UK government to be more bold against the SNP Scottish Government mission creep? And did the use of Section 35 demonstrate that there are tools within the devolved framework to address challenges within that working relationship that may arise from time to time? Lord Robertson, can I take you first?
Well, I'm an outsider, really, basically, on that, but it was always designed, to be a devolution settlement inside the United Kingdom. And if there are going to be measures passed by the Scottish Parliament that trespass over, the interests of the United Kingdom, then there has to be, and the legislation enshrines it, there has to be a mechanism for making sure that it is pulled back. And, in this case, the Gender Recognition Bill crossed the line in terms of the Equality Act on a UK basis, and therefore the United Kingdom government was absolutely right to do that. The Supreme Court will eventually make a decision, but pretty well everybody knows what the likely outcome is going to be. But, we didn't set up a separate Scotland. We set up a devolved Scotland inside the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has still got to have the power to make its view known.
Thank you. Lord Dunlop.
Yeah, I would agree very much with that. I think, Section 35 was written in as a safety valve to be used in exactly these circumstances. It would have been preferable, I think, if the two governments had been able, in advance of that button being pressed, to have come to an agreement. And I do think it was regrettable that when the UK government communicated its concern to the Scottish government, that at that point the Scottish government didn't put the bill on pause to see if a solution could be found to what seemed to me, a very legitimate concern that others had been raising. And that is the way good intergovernmental relations should work. But I think it is an important safety valve, and I think its use was entirely legitimate.
And Lord Wallace, just one more question, which links into that. Were you surprised that Section 35 was invoked when it was? And did the use of Section 35 suggest anything to you about the state of the intergovernmental relationship at that time?
Well, you were right earlier in your question to say it was unprecedented. It was literally unprecedented. I think I went back and checked the debate, thinking, before I actually comment on this, I better actually see what I said when that particular clause came before the House. And it was clause 33 then, during the committee stage of the Scotland Bill. 12th of May 1998, if you want to check it up. And Donald Dewar's view was that it was then meant to actually facilitate or oil the wheels of devolution, because there would inevitably be times when, and particularly I think in the cases of private law, which was devolved but could have overlap into reserved areas, where there could be something passed by the Scottish Parliament which technically did actually stray, although primarily in a devolved area, but strayed into reserve. And as the argument which Donald Dewar deployed, which I think I generally supported, was that this was to stop it being going too far. If it went too far, there was a mechanism there to stop it. But if it actually was just incidental almost, then the UK government wouldn't intervene. And the other interesting thing I found was that the accusation that this was Governor General powers, I think, was generally bandied around, but particularly by the Conservative front bench. So it just shows you how time passes. But I wouldn't want to preempt the court's decision on what will happen with this. I think it was. I think it would have been. I think Lord Dunlop suggested this. It would have been better if intergovernmental relations had been such that these things could have been sorted out, or at least addressed, because I don't think they were addressed in an intergovernmental basis before the bill passed at third reading in the Scottish Parliament, and it would have been better if that had been done then. in the circumstances, it didn't surprise me because I think the signals were there that something was going to happen. But the fact that most people had forgotten about Section 35 until it was invoked, I think suggested just how unusual this was. And my sincere hope would be that it is still very, very much the exception, rather than a precedent having been set, that it becomes normal. And if we have to wait another 24 years for it to be invoked again, that would be a good thing.
Just listening to all three of you this afternoon, and from our experience, sort of my experience in the last 4 years and beforehand, rather than forge a closer union between our nations, devolution has actually caused a fracturing of our union. What policies do you think the UK government needs to pursue to overcome this, Lord Dunlop?
Well, I recommend a very good review that looked at all of this, and I mean, I'm not sure I would sort of agree with the premise of your question that devolution has caused a fracturing of the union. I think particularly if there is more English devolution, I think it requires a change of mindset in the way the country is sort of governed, and that was really very much the basis of my review, that instead of command and control from Whitehall, you need civil servants who have the skills, negotiation skills, mediation skills, to work constructively with different parts, different levels of government, to produce what I think everybody wants. Everybody is involved in government and politics because they want to make life better for the people who elect them. And I think if there was more focus on that, rather than constitutional positioning, I think that would be a very good thing.
Thank you.
In my view, if we had far from fracturing the United Kingdom, devolution has united and kept the United Kingdom together. It was my profound belief at the beginning that if we had not had a proper devolution settlement, then the United Kingdom wouldn't exist today. You would have a separate Scotland, and you might even have a separate Wales, and you might have a united Ireland. But devolution for Scotland was the method by which we actually bound Scotland into the United Kingdom. So I don't accept the premise of what you're saying. It might not have been as wonderful as we made out or as we thought it could possibly be, and it's got its imperfections, but it's certainly better than it was, when 4 Conservative ministers who had no public support in Scotland at all were running the whole mechanism of government north of the border. So it has to be an improvement on that. Might not be perfect, but it's kept the United Kingdom as the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Yeah, and could I just say I endorse that. I think it was ahead of steam before 1997, and if there had not been devolution, then the dam would have burst.
Alan Brown, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just start with Lord Robertson first. Lord Robertson, earlier on, you'd made the joke that when you became Defence Secretary, you went along with the joke that was a demotion. You actually said such as a parochialism in Scotland. So how many of your colleagues actually thought Scotland was too parochial at that time?
What you said, you didn't say parochialism in
Scotland.
Scotland.
Such as a parochialism in Scotland.
We didn't.
Yes, we did.
No.
Well, let Lord Robertson reply.
I think, but I think there is a degree of parochialism that we have north of the border. I live in Scotland, so I've never been away from it or part of that as well. And the here's to us was like us sentiment, is still quite strong. I was in the lounge this morning along with other people, with guys in kilts on their way to Georgia. They looked to me like prosperous middle class businessmen, but they were still dressed in t-shirts and kilts and boots as well. So I don't think
not sure there was about the observation of guys in kilts, but did attitudes like that did that influence the powers that were given to the Scottish Parliament that was set up, for example?
No, not at all. No, Donald Dewar took over from me the Scottish portfolio, because Tony Blair wanted it to be given the highest rank. He was chief whip in opposition So, you know, it was giving him something that he believed in very strongly, and with the clout and authority that he had within the National Labour Party, they wanted me to go to defence because they wanted somebody there to be able to handle the issues that were facing the country at that time.
I mean, if you look at it setting up Scottish Parliament, quite often we've been told it's the most powerful devolved administration in the world. But if you actually look in a UK context, welfare, including pensions, is fully devolved to Northern Ireland. Energy policy, apart from nuclear energy, is devolved to Northern Ireland. So that's way, way more powerful in that aspect than even the Scottish Parliament. So, so is there a rationale why that approach was taken, that Scotland didn't get as many powers?
Yes, Scotland has got increasing powers all the time, and they're not being used. You know, Nigel Smith, the late Nigel Smith, that Lord Dunlop mentioned, who was the chairman of the Yes Cabinet.
My question was, so why were some of these powers devolved to Northern Ireland, but in setting up the Scottish Parliament, it was deemed that Scotland shouldn't have control of these issues? And obviously, when the Scottish Parliament was set up, it had much more limited spending powers and borrowing powers. Some of that subsequently changed, obviously, with the two subsequent Scotland Acts, but it was quite a tight setup in terms of powers that were given to the Scottish Parliament.
Well, they were huge powers. There were all the powers that had been exercised before when the Scottish office was there and the Conservatives were in power, plus a lot of extra powers, as well as that basic principle that all the powers would go to Scotland except for those that were reserved to Westminster. That was something that wasn't even conceived by the Constitutional Convention, even in its most ambitious times. So that was actually a major step by the UK in terms of the devolution settlement itself.
If I can just go to Lord Wallace just on powers and responsibilities of the Scottish Parliament. Now, one of your colleagues, Malcolm Bruce, speaking at a Lib Dem conference in Wales back in 2000, so not long after the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, he said, "The Scottish Parliament itself will not be able to meet the aspirations of the Scottish people, however, until it has control over their own revenues." Do you agree with Malcolm on that?
Well, we've done an awful lot since in terms of its revenues. I mean,
He's advocating full control over revenues.
There is now more control over revenues. The tax varying powers that were increased firstly by the 2012 Act and then subsequently by the 2016 Act has made a considerable difference. I mean, you know, you don't do. I mean, we didn't do everything once, but I think everyone at the time thought that what was included in the Scotland Act of 1998 was very substantial indeed. And as George makes the point, everything was devolved except things that were expressly
Do you agree with
reserved.
Do you agree with his premise of actually the Scottish Parliament should have full control over all revenues?
I would want a definition of all revenues, because I think there's some things which you know, which one wouldn't necessarily want to include that, because actually there's some taxation that's got to go from Scotland to a central pot, because that's what I mean. I have a strong view that one of the benefits of the union is that poverty in Gateshead is as important as to tackle as a poverty in Glasgow. And if I can make a contribution by paying my taxes of one form or another that helps alleviate poverty in Gateshead or Glamorgan as well as in Glasgow, I think that actually binds us together. And I think that's something that is quite important. And to say that I only want my money to go to help resolve poverty in Glasgow and stuff the rest of the places, that's not what I believe in.
That sounds like you think your colleague Malcolm Bruce was saying that, so because that's
I'm
what
not sure he was. I want to see the whole speech rather than one sentence taken out of context.
So can I just turn to something else? So in terms of intergovernmental relations, obviously you've got the Scotland office, and Scotland office, you know, obviously roles and responsibilities have changed over the years. But if I stick with yourself, Lord Wallace, so if I quote an article from the Herald in 2007, Prime Minister Gordon Brown was called upon today to scrap the Scotland office after it was branded the most pointless department in Whitehall. And that was your colleague, the current MP for Auckland Shetland, that was calling for the abolition of the Scotland office. It was actually a Lib Dem policy. But then, obviously, 2010, coalition government. So what was it about ministerial cars that changed your mind on the benefits of the Scotland office?
I think I'm on record, and you'll find you've quoted Alistair Carmichael. You could have quoted me if you'd actually done a bit more research. That I'd actually called for the abolition of the Scotland Office, and I think I said so again, Chairman, in evidence to this inquiry, a similar inquiry of this committee in 2019. And as I said already today, most of my relationships as a minister in the Scottish Government were with departmental ministers and not through the Scotland Office. And I think I said that when David Mundell was Secretary of State and David Liddington had sort of overall, that David Liddington had far more clout in government than the Secretary of State for Scotland. The Scotland Office, I think, did a good job at the time of Scottish Act, the Scotland Bill 12 of 2012
Why would you want to
26.
abolish it and then have two Lib Dem Secretary of States for Scotland?
Because there was no Tory to be Secretary of State for Scotland other than David Mundell.
It was quite an obvious. If there's no Tory to fill it and you agreed it should be abolished, why would you then fill that position?
Because it was a coalition government and there was not a coalition agreement to abolish the Scotland Office. But some of us have continued since to argue that the Scotland Office should be abolished. I think it did a good job during the passage of the Scotland Act 2012, during the passage of the Scotland Act of 2016. It was an important part then. But otherwise, I think it's far more important that you develop relationships at departmental level and not at the Scotland Office level.
We're going to have to wind up.
Can I just do one more to Lord Dunlop, if that's okay? So Lord Dunlop obviously spoke about intergovernmental relations. You've done a review. You've said that the current Prime Minister is obviously more favourable towards working collegiately with the Scottish Government. But it's not that long ago there was an announcement that 7 towns in Scotland are getting £2 million a year over a 10-year period. There was no consultation in the Scottish Government. My local authority is getting £2 million a year for Town Centre of Kilmarnock. So obviously I'm not going to argue against money coming to Kilmarnock. But there was no consultation in the East Ayrshire Council either in advance of that. So where's the transparency in the actual development of intergovernmental relations if Westminster are deciding here's some towns that are going to get £2 million a year for 10 years. Now obviously in my constituency there's actually other ways you maybe argue that the £2 million could be spent in other towns and villages. So why is it Westminster decides that Kilmarnock's getting £2 million a year but can only be spent in Kilmarnock?
Well, I mean, I would make 2 points. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm regretful about devolution is that there hasn't been onward devolution from Edinburgh to local areas in Scotland. And I'm not sure about the details of the particular projects in Kilmarnock, but my understanding is that the way this works is that these are local priorities that come to the UK government and they fund those. And from what I can see, that is hugely popular across Scotland.
There was no bid process, there was no dialogue, it was just £2 million a year to come.
There was a rationale provided. If he doesn't know, that's not for the witnesses.
I was making the point that there was no discussion with the local authority or the Scottish Government.
Order. This has been a really nice-natured session. So please, let's keep things orderly if we can.
And just finally on that, there are sometimes further calls for Westminster to bypass the Scottish Government, send money direct to councils, to local authorities, or to pay for transport projects that are actually, obviously transport has devolved. So again, how does that work with intergovernmental relations going forward?
Well, my own sort of preference is that the two governments, should work together. Because if you've got two parallel funding streams that never meet, it may be suboptimal. So in my review, because I think a lot of this is about creating the right incentives for more collaborative behaviour. And my sort of view, which wasn't accepted by the government, was that you should use these funds to encourage that sort of collaboration. So I'm on public record as saying that, the government chose not to go that way. I think one of the reasons the UK government may not have gone down that road is I think, they put in, billions of pounds into city and growth deals and didn't always get the recognition for that money that was put in. So, it is much more explicit now what the UK government is investing.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it. That's a very interesting point at the end there. It's just to get the recognition. But thank you for that. We're going to suspend proceedings just briefly to have the next panel. But can I just say to all of you, thank you ever so much. We knew this would be an interesting, even entertaining and informative session. We certainly got that today, so thank you very much. And if there's anything else that you feel you could help this inquiry, I know you've been here before, Lord Wallace, and you were very helpful to us last time. So anything else that you feel would usefully help this inquiry,
Thank you.
please get in touch.
Thank you for your courtesy.
If we could have the next guest, please.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Heavily in the early days of the Scottish Affairs Committee, we now have two professor gentlemen who were involved very heavily in the early days of devolution, who have had a variety of roles in the ongoing conversation about intergovernmental relations, and I'll let them introduce themselves and what they do. Starting with you, Professor Gallagher.
Hello there, I'm Jim Gallagher. These days I'm an honorary professor in the universities of St Andrews and Glasgow, but I've been around devolution for far too long, having worked in the Scottish office before it and made a very small contribution to the Scotland Act, and then working for Prime Minister Cameron on IGR relations in 1999-2000 and in the Cabinet Office, back there in 2007 with Prime Minister Brown, left the government a dozen years ago, and have continued to interest myself both academically and politically in the Scottish question.
Thank you. Martin.
Good afternoon, I'm Kieran Martin. I currently teach at the University of Oxford at the Blavatnik School of Government. I was in the civil service for 23 years until 2020. My principal role in devolution matters came between 2011 and late 2013 under the coalition, among other things helping Prime Minister Cameron and Secretary of State Moore with what became the Edinburgh Agreement of October 2012. Other roles which touched on devolution matters were more junior roles in the National Audit Office, Treasury and Cabinet Office, and also my last role for 7 years was Head of Cybersecurity for the UK Government, which of course touched on relations with the Scottish Government and all the devolved governments on matters of national security.
Excellent, and thank you ever so much for those very concise introductions. Could I sort of come right up to date and discuss the current condition of intergovernment relations? We're here looking back at the 25-year Act. It's been characterised that a meeting was an inter-parliamentary forum in Edinburgh, the Scottish Parliament, and it was variously described as they've never been so bad. Government relations have barely been in such poor condition. There was a sense from devolved administrations that instead of things being done with, they were being done to. There was a sense that they weren't being listened to by UK government, and because of innovations such as UKIMA, the UK Internal Market Act, there was a bigger sense that perhaps devolved governments were really just to fall into line behind the general view of the UK. How did we get to a situation where devolved administrations are feeling so alienated and so out of the loop when it comes to intergovernment relations? Was there something that was in the early stages when we designed all this that would lead inevitably to the situation? Or is this just something that has happened because of changing relationships and the changing dynamic and the whole infrastructure and structure? We'll start with you, Professor Gallagher.
The short answer is Brexit. As I said in the written evidence I submitted to the committee, a well-managed Brexit would have strained intergovernmental relations very substantially. For two reasons. One, because of political differences on the question of leaving or staying across the devolved reserve boundary, if you like. And secondly, because when the devolution settlements were designed, there was an implicit and indeed explicit assumption that the UK was and would remain part of the EU. As it happened, and I'm not making a particularly partisan point here, we did not have a well-managed Brexit process. We had a Brexit process for which the government didn't have a plan, and for several years did not have the capacity to deliver anything. And so we had that 3 years in which the UK government seemed effectively paralysed. The UK has now left the EU, but much of what you've described is the collateral damage of that process. On the relatively smaller but nevertheless plus side, the structural changes which have been made following the Dunlop review, to which you referred earlier, Chair, and the new ministerial councils have at least the potential to be a better foundation for intergovernmental relations than the previous joint ministerial committees, for a variety of reasons which we can go into if you like. Potential, of course, has to be delivered, and in the end this depends on attitudes and behaviour, and as you heard from previous members, the degree to which trust is built across the boundary between the two administrations. And that requires changes on both sides.
And I remember Professor Martin, and I know, of course, remember when you were in Cabinet Office and advising the Prime Minister, between the periods of 2011 and 2014, roughly the time that Lord Dunlop was there too. I mean, this should have been the biggest fracture, most disruptive period in intergovernment relations, the lead up to a Scottish independence referendum, but it wasn't. It was actually reasonably good relations. I could see Professor Gallagher shaking his head, possibly not in agreement, but that was nothing compared to the difficulties we've encountered since Brexit. Is there any particular reason why Brexit has been such a dramatic impactor on intergovernment relations, and how could it have been done better to end in being a better situation where there is more trust between devolved administrations and the UK government?
I think I would concur with what Professor Gallagher said, that even a well-managed Brexit would have strained intergovernmental regulations, and like him, I'm not trying to make a partisan point. I think it was an external shock not envisaged by those framing the devolution settlement, and particularly with the way the vote went in different constituent parts. And obviously this committee is centred on Scotland, which had the largest Remain vote in the United Kingdom, and each of the four parts was going to be particularly difficult. Where I might extend the argument is that I think Brexit, however, was one of three shocks which has made the atmosphere in the 2020s more different to what it was a decade ago. The other is COVID. I do have experience of much shorter term national crises, much less serious, thankfully, in things like counterterrorism and cybersecurity, where by and large the devolution mechanisms, the intergovernmental mechanisms worked extremely well. But I think both the seriousness of COVID and its longevity frayed that in ways that I think the system found very difficult to cope with, and it became very political, and we're now seeing obviously that narrative contested in the inquiry. And the third reason, perhaps contentiously, is the referendum itself, the Scottish referendum of 2014. I think there is a strain of opinion at UK-wide level that took a 55 to 45 vote for the United Kingdom to stay together as much too close for comfort, and sees that perhaps collaborative period that Lord Cameron refers to proudly in his memoirs and in his memorandum as complacent. Again, I'm not trying to make a partisan point. I'm reflecting views that have been expressed in the debate. that perhaps the UK government, the UK central government was excessively indulgent at that period in time and needs to toughen up. So, for example, you see in the rhetoric given in former Prime Minister Johnson's statement to the COVID inquiry that he would not want to chair a meeting as Prime Minister with devolved leaders because the UK was not a mini EU. I mean, that is very strikingly different in tone from, say, Lord Cameron's memorandum. And
I mean, there's one term that comes to mind, and I don't know if it's a fair description, but there's one term that, like, we've become increasingly familiar with: muscular unionism or aggressive unionism, and this has come to describe the way that, like, successive Conservative Prime Ministers have approached devolution. Do you think there's anything in that, or is the Scottish Government just been unduly sensitive, when it comes to intergovernmental relations?
There's far too much muscle, but there's muscle on both sides. There's muscular nationalism as well as muscular unionism. What the Scottish people clearly express is a desire for autonomy, but not a desire for separation. And the trouble with muscular folks at either end of it is that one set of muscles is pulling in the direction of autonomy, and the other is pulling in the direction of separation. So we need to find a more collaborative approach across all of this stuff, actually. So if you were to ask me, am I in favour of muscular unionism, I would say certainly not, but you can't look at it only in isolation.
Is this your view too, Professor Martin? Is this something that you're observing when you're looking afar about what's happening in Scotland? Is this term muscular unionism, is there any validity to it? Is it something that you feel has actually been used in practice?
As I think, as a political narrative, it is stronger in UK-wide debate than it was 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago. I think as a feature of government policy, it is sometimes present, but I think it can be overdone. So, for example, I would say some of the ways, but both the outcomes and the processes which led to those outcomes of the Brexit process were pretty muscular. Whereas I would not myself take the view that the invocation of Section 35 of the 1998 Scotland Act for the first time was muscular unionism. It was, as we heard from the previous more expert political panel, it is a design feature of the devolution settlement, whether you like it or not, and there's nothing untoward or improper about its use under lawful circumstances which are now being tested. So I think, yes, there is a creed of muscular unionism that is gaining some strength in some parts of our political system. It sometimes manifests itself in government policy, but it's very easy to invoke anything you don't like from the devolved end as muscular unionism, and that's not entirely fair.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. I know Douglas Russell was coming quickly.
It was just one point to Professor Gallagher. You were mentioning how Brexit was a shock that caused a strain in intergovernmental relations, but in your evidence, your written evidence, you also cite 2007 as being a shock from which those intergovernmental relations have never fully recovered. Do you mean the election of a nationalist minority government?
There were a series of things which changed. I think that the evidence, I haven't got it in front of me, is intended to say that this series of shocks hasn't
fully recovered from. You said 2007 and 2016.
Yeah. So the political divergence in 2007 was a shock to the system. I know this because I had been in the number 10 machine under the previous administration, the Blair administration, when intergovernmental relations were pretty easy and informal for the most part. And in my view, rather neglected, certainly after I left. And then 2007, there was a sudden realisation that it was possible that there would be people who weren't in the same political party running the devolved settlement. And that was a shock to the system because the system wasn't ready for that kind of divergence. And the Brexit was another shock. Obviously, in one sense, just to pick up on what Kieran had to say there, the referendum was both a shock and not a shock, not the Brexit referendum, but the Scottish referendum. It was possible to agree the process, and I think Kieran and his colleagues did a good job on that. I think I wouldn't have done it quite that way, but the general proposition, I think, was perfectly good. I think what we didn't plan ahead for was the outcome of the referendum. Obviously, the people in Edinburgh were planning enthusiastically for a victory for the yes side. They didn't get it. I don't think we thought through what the kind of outcome that we actually got would mean, because it didn't settle the question. There were people who were not prepared to accept no for an answer, and that has been a strain issue ever since. Add to that Brexit, which was not merely a referendum outcome that some folk didn't like, myself included, I may say. It was also a set of changes which were disruptive to the fabric of the devolution settlement. And put all those things together, and it would be a surprise if intergovernmental relations this year were sweetness and light. But we need to be clear, we do need to do something to improve them.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for coming along. And I was fascinated about what you've said about the shocks, Professor Gallagher. And one of them you haven't mentioned is 2011, when the victory by the SNP was much bigger than 2007, and actually led directly to the referendum. But it also led to the two branches of the civil service being almost in opposition to one another, because their job is to promote government policy, and the two government policies were completely different. So did you notice at that time, and have you noticed since, any sort of divergence in the relationship between the civil service in Westminster and the civil service in Holyrood?
I think a bigger factor than having divergent ministers with divergent political objectives has actually, as was referred to in the previous evidence session, is simply the passage of time. There are, I must be getting old because I know almost none of the civil servants in St Andrew's House now from my time there. And similarly, although a number of them have had Whitehall experience, what we don't seem to have is the kind of exchange programmes that Jim Wallace referred to earlier, that once we did have. And what we don't have are things that we had before devolution, which was that the civil service saw itself as working, well, was working for the same set of ministers, and was therefore very collaborative and open across departments. Now, any inter-civil service relationship comes with a health warning. I can't really commit my minister to anything. I can't really tell you what he thinks, no? Which is not quite how it is inside a government. And what we don't have, and this again goes back to the previous session, is the structures which build the relationships and the trust which you need when things get tough. There's no point just having meetings when you're in crisis, because you've no idea who your interlocutor is. You need to know the individuals on the other side of the table. And that applies as much in the civil service as it applies at the ministerial level.
Okay. Professor Martin, did you notice a discernible change or an evolution in the relationships when you were a civil servant?
Actually, no, and I think you can debate, whether or not the system works optimally for whatever political objectives particular people have. But I think it's a remarkable feature of the British system that, and probably the most remarkable period was the 2011 to 2014 period, where you had a literally existential question for the country. You had a single civil service, which is it has been devolved in Northern Ireland, but in Scotland has never been devolved. You had, and I remember, slightly incredulous Spanish interlocutors talking about this. You had a situation where, the UK government civil service was producing a set of analysis papers in support of the case for remaining in the UK, and strikingly from the Spanish point of view, the Scottish government was allowed to use the civil service to make the contrary case. I think at that time, because it was it seemed quite febrile at the time, perhaps in the light of the last decade, comparatively less so, but there was a certain amount of commentary around, for example, Sir Peter Housden as head of the civil service and as permanent secretary to the Scottish government, and people like the late Sir Jeremy Haywood and Lord Macpherson in the UK government. But actually, as for example Suzanne Haywood's biography of Jeremy Haywood makes clear, behind the scenes, that period that the chair was talking about is a relatively harmonious one, despite the underlying huge tensions. Was oiled by, in part by good civil service contacts, in a way that, again, in a way that perhaps a muscular unionist might not like. Further down the line, I was not directly involved in any of the Brexit negotiations, nor really in the COVID period, although I was a Crown servant for the first sort of 8 months of COVID. But in my own fields, for example, in cybersecurity, I think even though it engaged devolved equities very frequently, the relationship was cooperative, I think partly because nobody had a political incentive to politicise it. But from the talk around the profession of the civil service around things like Brexit was that the single civil service was attempting to act as a calming and cohesive influence where possible amidst pretty rancorous political division. In a professional way. Now you can say that's a good thing or it's a bad thing, but I think the cohesion of the civil service, as for example evidenced by, and I'm reluctant to get into personalities, but when it came for the former First Minister, for Nicola Sturgeon, to choose a permanent secretary, she chose someone from the ranks of the civil service in Whitehall who was a specialist in the administration of social security. That I think shows a certain amount of continuing cohesion in the system, which is perhaps less different in 2023 than it was in 2013 than you might have predicted.
Thank you. Professor Gallagher, you said that you felt that relations had deteriorated between the two governments. Do you think we are aware in both parliaments of what needs to be done to improve relationships, or do you think we're just allowing it to happen? Do you think that you can discern some sort of determination to improve it for the benefit of everyone?
That's a hard question, but an important area. I think one of the if I go back quite a long way to the report of the Calmon Commission, of which I was the secretary, and one of the areas which the Calmon Commission opened up, and which I think we have not taken to completion, is interparliamentary relations. I mean, it's a notorious aspect of IGR, intergovernmental relations, worldwide, that they're a great place for governments to avoid scrutiny, right? Because you go away to the negotiating table and go, it's the best I could do for you, okay? And that can't really be questioned. And one of the challenges that parliaments have worldwide, not just here, is having some visibility of that. So I do think that part of the issue here, only part of it, in the route towards fixing this, is a greater degree of transparency and scrutiny of the intergovernmental relations process. But we do need, as I said in my written evidence to you, a reset of that process. It's hit pretty much rock bottom. And it's hit rock bottom in terms of trust, and Kieran Martin mentioned the COVID process. Thank goodness I was hiding behind the sofa throughout that process, so I had nothing to do with it. But it's pretty plain that the distrust at ministerial level got in the way of doing effective intergovernmental cooperation, at least at the beginning of the process. And that's deeply unfortunate in those circumstances. And secondly, and I'm sorry to have to say this, the UK government's systematic habit of breaching the Sewel Convention is deeply unhelpful. If we say to the people of Scotland, you've got a legislature and we won't interfere with it unless some exceptional circumstance, or perhaps not even then, and then apparently routinely cease to follow that convention, I think there's a thing to be done. Conversely, because it takes two to tango all the time in this, there's a tendency towards autarky in St Andrew's House, poor preparation of legislation and material, which gets you into the kind of fankle that requires governments to use Section 35. So both sides need to contribute to that process of rebuilding the relations. And one place to start would be to move back to a world in which, in private and in confidence, governments share their proposed legislative programmes with one another to avoid the UK government either accidentally or deliberately breaching the Sewel Convention, or to avoid the Scottish government so trampling over reserved law or similar issue that the UK government finds itself using the powers in the Scotland Act. There's an opportunity for a fresh start in that we have a new First Minister who's not been long in office. Poor man is still finding his feet, I think, to be fair to say. We seem to have a slightly new administration in Westminster only today. So there is the chance, and there are structures which in principle could be used properly to do that. But it does require a change in behaviour.
Again, I'm just conscious of time because I want to help Professor Martin, who needs to leave a little bit earlier. But so we've got half an hour left, if that's okay.
I was only going to say, would it be fair to characterise what you've said as perhaps pointing a way that we might have avoided the recent controversies over things like GRR, the deposit return scheme, if there had been that better cooperation between the governments before legislation was actually put forward?
Manifestly. I regard those two pieces of legislation as an example of how not to do devolved legislation.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you to our witnesses. I also have to leave. I'm heading over to the Treasury to fight for our whisky industry in the autumn statement, so I apologise I have to leave early for that. Professor Gallagher, you said something quite interesting in response to an earlier question. What would you have changed if you were in charge of the referendum in 2014? You said to Professor Martin you wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, a fair question. I think that the process was too long drawn out. I think it wasn't a 6-week campaign, but I think 2 years was too long for everyone. And I think we underplanned what would happen afterwards. We thought that would be it. Either there would be a yes vote, in which case all sorts of things might happen, but we didn't think ahead to what would happen afterwards. And I was guilty of that as anyone else, because I was so caught up in the campaign that I didn't think beyond the date.
Professor Martin, what do you think of that?
I think it's fair. I mean, I think the 2 years is a fair criticism. I think also, there was I think the UK government was unprepared for the constitutional trauma of contemplating this question. I think we didn't understand the law until, for example, Lord Wallace really gripped it, and so you're not allowed to talk about law officers' advice, but put it this way, I think as a private citizen, I was reasonably confident how last year's Supreme Court judgment would pan out, having worked with Lord Wallace, but we hadn't done that work before 2011, which I think was a mistake of statecraft, frankly, not to have set in place something, a strong devolved parliament, which, although clearly did not have the power to legislate for the referendum, certainly could elect a majority in favour of one, could pass a motion, could apply a lot of pressure. There were mechanisms such as Section 30. We didn't really know enough about that sort of thing, so we were slightly caught on the hoof. So, for example, and you can chart your way through 2011 in this, when the then First Minister Alex Salmond is saying things like, oh, it'll be in the second half of 2014. It's a very different environment now because people understand the law, but back then, that was accepted as, well, that's how it's going to be. So I think we should have been better prepared. I think for the aftermath, and I suspect you will take a different view, but I think one of the ways, specifically, and I think Professor Gallagher and I disagree on this, but one of the ways is, under what circumstances would this ever happen again in the event of something that didn't put the issue to bed, to be followed unexpectedly by a major shock to the devolution system. So, I think if we meant a generation, let's say 20, 25 years, there was no reason not to put that in the Edinburgh Agreement. If we really, really meant it, I think it's quite hard to sustain something that important after that close a vote, followed by Brexit, just as a sort of almost ephemeral construct. But I think from the nationalist point of view at the time, that side had to project confidence they were going to win, therefore there was no need to discuss what might happen in the event of a reasonably narrow result in future. From the unionist side, there was the pretty catchy and effective slogan about not having never-endums and so forth. But I think if you're looking for responsible, stable governance, it might have just been better to say, at the time, if you want a Westminster, explicitly Westminster backed legally signed referendum, this cannot take place for another 20, 25 years, or cannot take place until there's a vote of X in the Scottish Parliament, or something. And the complete absence to do any planning for that, I think, left us in a tricky situation in 2021, which is now past, but could arise in the future.
I think that answer alone could open up another 3 hours, let alone 30 minutes. Two short points I want to put across. The presiding officer in the Scottish Parliament has a role to play in terms of certifying that anything coming forward to be voted on is within the competencies of the Scottish Parliament, but we have seen issues raised through the Section 35 that suggests that the UK government don't agree with that. Do you think that power is being correctly used and advised to the presiding officers currently and in the past?
I think the premise of your question is not quite right. The presiding officer is required to certify legislation as to whether it's within the competence, but of course that doesn't stop the legislation being considered, because in principle at least, changes could be made to the legislation during its passage in order to make it competent. But the whole point of Section 35 is not that the legislation is incompetent. The legislation is competent, but has knock-on effects in the reserved area. So Section 35 isn't a competence issue. And in fact, I had to dust off Section 35 as well. Crikey, what was this? I'd forgotten all about it, because it hadn't been used for 20 years. Section 35 is a consequence of the widely drawn powers of the Scottish Parliament. As part of the Scottish Parliament is that anything that isn't reserved is devolved, and therefore, and the reservation test is that legal test relates to. And relates to means is mainly about. So legislation which is mainly about a devolved matter, not mainly about a reserved matter, can nevertheless properly affect reserved areas without being outside of competence. So there needs to be a bit of a safety in it to say, yeah, it does have that effect, and really that's not on. So oddly enough, Section 35 is a sign of the power, not the weakness of the Scottish Parliament.
And widely drawn powers, as you say, in contrast to what Mr Brown said earlier on. Finally, in terms of intergovernmental relations and the state of them, if we take out a pandemic, because I think we could always look to a pandemic and see there are extreme circumstances there, do you think the public really understand or care if the two governments sometimes bicker, don't get on particularly well with each other, probably expect a unionist and a nationalist government to take different views? Surely they're looking specifically in Scotland at devolved competencies in terms of their health service, the police system, the justice system, education for their children, funding to local government. Do you think this has cut through with voters in Scotland if there aren't good relations? And would improved relations really make a difference to taxpayers and voters in Scotland, to the public services they receive?
Go first.
I think you look at the various polling trackers on trust in the various institutions, which across the UK tend to have been higher in devolved for the devolved legislatures than the Westminster ones. I think by and large, do voters spend a great deal of time thinking about these things? No. Do they notice tension? I think, I'm afraid I can't really answer that without referring back to the pandemic, even though you tried to exclude it from the question.
That is a more extreme example, though.
It is a more extreme example, but I think that I think it showed a desire for strong local government, strong devolved government in key areas, where if there was tension, there was at least a noticeable desire for that tension to be managed to be managed away. Now, I was conscious of, for example, Lord Dunlop's point in the previous answer in the exchange with Mr Brown about, for example, the UK government perhaps being more reticent about some of the more joint endeavours because they felt that they hadn't got sufficient credit for it. I think that, you know, in the past few years, it has been hard to sell successfully joint endeavours to the benefit of both sides.
On the question of whether the public would be happier if the governments got on better, in a sense, I don't really care. What I would want to happen is that the outcomes were better. That, for example, the process of recycling cans and bottles was made to work rather than runs into the sand. What we see if we look at the polling, however, is that 75% of the population, when asked the question, do the governments cooperate well enough, answer no. And the public are right in that. And I mean, our job, those of us who have or you are still involved in the governmental processes of the country, is to make sure that in the engine room of government, all the bits work together effectively. The public don't want to look at the engine room very often, but they do want to get somewhere. So it's outcomes for the public that matter, and cooperation is essential to deliver those.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Alan Hart, Alan Brown.
Thank you, Chair. So we've seen in the last few years, since 2019 really, the bills passed in the UK Parliament where devolved legislatures have withheld their consent. And as you've said, Professor Gallagher, the one overwhelming reason is leaving the EU, which wasn't a normal event, which has necessitated legislation across the UK. And the SNP government, Scottish government, doesn't agree with that. There's also, witnesses have highlighted here today, political differences of opinion between the various governments, but particularly looking at Scotland and the UK government. How would you therefore describe the UK government's current approach to the Sewel Convention, and what does it demonstrate about the wider intergovernmental relations?
Okay. First, the Sewel Convention was enunciated way back in 1998, and it deals with the problem that we do not have a codified constitution in which some bits of responsibility belong only to one level of government. That's the characteristic of a federal system that in the US, for example, some things that the states have that the feds can't touch. But in our system of parliamentary sovereignty, it's quite hard to hand down legislative responsibility because Parliament, in the theory, still retains it. And the principle of Sewel is to say that we are creating a legislature which has power and responsibility of its own, and Parliament won't interfere with it. In the end, people said normally, which I think was possibly an error, actually. Of course, Brexit wasn't normal, and in that sense, the words of the Sewel Convention have been obeyed, but the spirit of it has not. In particular, the internal market legislation was, in my view, first of all, unnecessary, and secondly, imposed on the devolved inappropriately. And it's not ever going to be used very much. In fact, that could have been fixed without legislation at all, in my view. So I think this has caused a real problem. I think that the present government or its successor should rebuild the trust of the Sewel Convention. But as I said earlier, I think it does take two sides to build trust. And we need a change of behaviour in Edinburgh, as well as a change of behaviour in London. We should go back to a world in which governments routinely, privately share their legislative programmes one with another to ensure that if there were going to be problems, they knew long in advance. And that should have been done in relation to the GRR bill, but it should also have been done in relation to the various bits of enabling Brexit legislation. And in fact, on the internal market stuff, it's my view that the framework of the agreed common frameworks across those areas would have been adequate to do the job.
Martin?
Very little to add. I was once at a meeting in my national security days where a very senior British security chief was explaining the concept of a convention to a rather baffled foreign partner, and said that in the British system, a convention is something that always applies until we decide that it doesn't. And I think we've reached that stage with Sewel where, I mean, I don't know if Professor Gallagher would agree with this, but I think, you know, although although almost entirely in the unique and unusual circumstances of Brexit has now been breached so often and so fundamentally, I'm not sure it merits the term anymore. I think Professor Gallagher says rebuild. I think we're almost in semantics as to whether it's still a relevant part of the system.
Would it not just be better just to say Sewel isn't working as best, doing away with it totally? There's no point of it being there if it's not been observed. It was there as a safety net, wasn't it?
I would go to the other extreme and say it has not been observed and it should be observed and it should be given teeth.
We need to have it in statute, as was suggested.
In statute already.
Statute that would always be observed.
Right, and we need a mechanism for observing it, but that takes me into reforming the entire UK constitution, which is maybe beyond where you want to be today.
Yes, it certainly is, yeah.
But there are proposals to do precisely that.
What, like federal? A federal UK?
No, the proposals of the Labour Party's Commission on Constitutional Reform that Gordon Brown chaired deals with precisely this issue. Right, maybe not. This may not be the day to explain the full mechanics of it, but if you're interested, please do ask.
So, just looking at the recent legislation, you mentioned the UK Internal Market and Retained EU Law Acts. What do they say about the UK government and how it's managing the policy and political differences with devolved governments, particularly Scotland, because we're looking at Scotland post-EU exit? Professor Martin.
What does the Internal Market Act say about relations? Sorry,
yes, and how the UK government is managing policy and political differences.
Well, I think we're now in a different phase. I think there was
post-Brexit now.
Yes. So, and I think the period of Brexit, as you mentioned in your question, was the withholding of multiple legislative consent motions, the imposition of the Internal Market Act, but not really its use. That was a very disruptive, almost traumatic event for devolution. I think that's now stabilising, partly because of underlying political circumstances. As you say, we're post-Brexit now. There are fewer of those ruptures happening. There are fewer reasons for them to happen. I think it's partly attitudinal as well. I mean, we heard from the previous panel of former politicians about, the period where, for example, there was a full tenure, albeit a short one, of a Prime Minister not talking to the devolved administrations. That's now that situation is now passed. And actually, whilst I don't want to say too much about this because of the pending Supreme Court judgment, I thought the way in which the Secretary of State for Scotland framed the Section 35 intervention was actually rather astute. It was not a highly politicised intervention. I'm sure that was on the basis, in terms of the actual language used, I'm sure that was partly on the basis of legal advice, but also partly it was, trying to place that intervention firmly in the context of a devolution settlement rather than a particularly, even though as your question to the previous panel said, I mean, it was literally unprecedented in the true sense of the word, but it was presented as the implementation of a normal feature. So I think we're at an interesting phase. We're in the final year of a parliament. The underlying optics have stabilised a bit. There are less scope for clashes. So we're at a period, frankly, of choice. A reset has happened. Professor Gallagher called for a reset. I think one is almost happening by default. So there are now choices in the post-Brexit, end of this parliament, beginning of the next parliament, transition of political leadership. There are choices to be made about the relationships.
I know we have to let you away, Professor Martin, and I've still got Mr. Duke and Mr. Brown to come in with questions. So if you've...
No, I'll call it a day there. Thank you.
David Duke.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both for coming along today. I've pretty much been making notes ever since you both started speaking, so I'm going to go back a little bit over some old ground. First of all, Professor Gallagher, you mentioned, I think one of the key points you mentioned that I particularly interested me was this idea of the two legislators coming together, even privately, at the start of each session to compare notes on what they were planning, so that to avoid, not necessarily to avoid any conflict, but at least know in advance when those conflicts might come up and be better prepared for them. mentioned the Gender Recognition Act as one example. Deposit return scheme was another. HPMAs, I have to mention that as the MP for Baffinbuck and Fish is very important, was possibly another one. Would it be fair to say that the actual causes behind these initiatives, the intentions, the good intentions behind some of these attempts at changing the law has been harmed by that failure to actually progress in the way that you would have described? Would have been a better way to do it?
Yes, I think that's entirely fair. I go back to what now seems like the late Middle Ages, when I was running the Cabinet Office legislative programme for the UK government, when we were in the habit of sharing that programme with the devolved administrations in confidence, which was always respected. And we flushed out the issues at an earlier stage when we did so. It never worked in the other direction, partly because people didn't really think about it, to be honest. But the two of the examples you mentioned, I'm not well informed on fisheries at the moment, but the gender recognition material is a classic area where you've got what could be described as a shared space between the government's equalities laws on one side, gender recognition on the other. And there are more of those shared spaces now than there used to be. There's a shared space in economic development, which has always been there. There's a shared space in welfare. And now that we're outside the EU, there's a shared space in agriculture and in fisheries and environmental protection and many other areas that used to be EU responsibilities. So the argument for cooperation and the argument for prior notice and the argument for officials, go back to the civil service questions, to work together, is stronger than it's ever been. And we need governments on both sides that are prepared to do that and not be obsessed with their sovereignty on the one hand in Westminster or their desires for sovereignty on the other hand in Scotland.
Sounds like a worthy future to aspire to.
I live in hope.
But on again, I've just as you're giving me that answer just now, I've just written down the expression shared space, and it sounds like a good thing. It sounds like the ideal scenario for collaboration to take place. But it sounds like, from what you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that Brexit, for example, has created more of these shared spaces that wasn't shared between the UK government and devolved administrations before because it was held by the EU. So even though a lot of those powers have come back from Brussels through Westminster and devolved to devolved administrations, is it fair to say that that increase in the number of shared spaces and maybe grey areas between who's actually responsible or who wants responsibility is actually added to the problem?
I think the territory is not as well mapped out as it should be. Paradoxically, agriculture, which, as was mentioned earlier, is one of those areas where we had a shared space between the governments in influencing the EU and the intergovernmental relations, and that historically have worked very well. I don't think they're working quite so well at the moment because the UK hasn't got it sorted out in its own head who's responsible for what. But there is the opportunity to do that. There will be perhaps an opportunity to reset this, and I very much hope that it's taken.
Thanks for that answer, and I'll come to Professor Martin in a second. But just before I do, or maybe I'll ask Professor Martin this question about. There's a series of ministries or directorates within the Scottish Government that seem to be, at least at face value, when I look at them, completely and utterly reserved, such as the Constitution. We've got a Minister for the Constitution, we've got energy ministers, we've got ministers responsible for international development, foreign affairs, I think it is, and international trade. How does that actually work, or how should that work when you're dealing with ministers and officials in a devolved administration working on functions that are completely reserved to the UK Parliament?
I think it's a very political question. Again, I think there is, well, there's a technocratic aspect to this and a political aspect to it. So if you take external relations from a sub-nation state unit, I went to a very interesting discussion on cybersecurity between Europe and the United States, hosted by the Bavarian mission to Brussels. So it does happen in other countries, but under our system, it is within the rights. Should a United Kingdom government and Parliament so choose, to expressly forbid, should it wish, or it could put this in legislation, it could do whatever it like, to expressly forbid activity and spending by devolved administrations on such matters. And the UK, it might require legislation. It could be tested in the courts, but under the model of a single civil service, and we had this a lot. This was a huge issue, very political issue during the referendum campaign that I alluded to earlier in the discussion with Ms. Jardine. Should the Scottish government, as distinct from the Yes campaign or the Scottish National Party or whoever, be allowed to put forward the prospectus for independence? And the Cameron-led coalition decided that it would not object to the civil service machine supporting the Scottish government writing and publishing at public expense the independence white paper. So it is a very political decision. Of course, more recently we've had the things with the now former Foreign Secretary, now Home Secretary, issuing guidance to British missions abroad, saying that the Scottish ministers are not to have discussions supervised. So I think it takes you into quite expressly political territory, where by international standards the British state has so far been quite benign.
David, you're going to have to wind up just like Mr.
We'll just go one more last question for Professor Martin, if that's okay. I know you need to get away. Because it's on that 2012 Edinburgh Agreement that I think you're referring to. And I think Dr. Paul Anderson of Liverpool, John Moores University, I've got him quoted here in written evidence that the Edinburgh Agreement represented a success for intergovernmental relations and avoided much of the acrimonious wrangling that is found in other states where electorally successful pro-independence political parties. So it was seen as I think there was an expression used at the time, it was like a gold standard for making or predicting a successful referendum result. And David Cameron at the time also described the agreement as the greatest proof point for success of the Respect agenda. But it was also said, I think it was Professor Gallagher earlier, that it clearly didn't settle the question of independence. So there's two questions. One is what went wrong? And I think I know what the answer's probably going to be on that, but probably more within your experience is what can we learn from that period? If we got to that point where it was generally recognised as being the gold standard, if we can be colloquial about it, of devolving legislation, at least temporarily, for the matter of the Constitution to be decided by the Scottish Parliament. And to everyone's agreement, it was voted for here and it passed here in Westminster as well. What can we learn from that to move forward and improve intergovernmental?
So a lot of this has been covered already, and I know the chair wants me to be brief. So I think just on what went wrong, I think you're expecting me to say Brexit. I'm actually going to say it was relatively close. I mean, 55-45 is it's not recount territory, but in a relatively small voting population, as people in the Brexit debate have said, if it had been a 52-48 vote to remain, we'd probably still be arguing about membership of the European Union in 2023 in the UK, because it was, it was a reasonably tight vote. The issue might not have been settled simply by virtue of that. In terms of the future, there's been a lot of very interesting contributions from Jim from the previous panel. The one thing I would think about is that there's actually scope for strategic thinking in both capitals, and if possible, a strategic conversation. I think, for example, if you look comparatively and internationally, we can talk about British exceptionalism and so on, but it is genuinely exceptional that this democracy is relatively, by international standards, relaxed about its own peaceful breakup, but it is relatively incurious about the mechanisms by which that discussion might be held over time. It really is. Most countries, look at what happened in Spain in 2010, where the constitution says the Kingdom of Spain cannot be divided. Now, of course, there's negotiations going on in Spain. It's quite messy. But anyway, I do think we need to think strategically about how to manage the constitutional tensions in this country, which are quite unusual.
Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. To Professor Martin, just to ask how effectively you think the IGR machinery was, or how effectively it was used during the COVID-19 pandemic response, and also just to set it up, because we don't have much time. So we heard recently the UK COVID inquiry that Dominic Cummings sent a message to Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's still Prime Minister, and was talking about COBRA, and he said, not with the DAs, i.e. the devolved administrations, on the effing phone all the time either, so people can't tell the truth. So what do you think about that as a civil servant working for government? That was his attitude to devolved administrations.
COVID was so serious and lasted for such a long time, it broke all the crisis management systems of the state, including those that related to devolution. And there's plenty of profane language about all sorts of aspects of it. So it broke the crisis management system, including the devolved aspects. It was so unusual. I do think that actually one of the features of devolution all the way through, whether it's Labour-led, whether it's coalition, SNP, whatever, or single-party government and Conservative government, SNP, actually crisis management by and large has worked reasonably well, where people have been grown up, sensible, have exchanged information. I remember very clearly, because I was in the Cabinet Secretary's office, the Glasgow Airport bomb attempt in 2007, just after the SNP minority administration came to power. Everybody maintained confidence, as we didn't worry about, there was trust immediately. So I wouldn't, COVID is so exceptional, and we need to look as a state about managing something of that magnitude. Don't throw out the crisis.
Involved the administration, just a performance, just a show. You still think that? In
many other crises in which I was directly involved, which were more, if you like, pardon the phrase, given the seriousness of some of them, more normal than COVID, the procedures worked well. Information was shared, trust was built in, and posturing was not the predominant activity.
Yeah, but given the seriousness of clearly the COVID pandemic and people dying, surely that should have made sharing of information more inclusive instead of exclusive, like that posture I just detailed.
I think there are some aspects of the COVID pandemic that worked pretty well at various aspects of it. I think, the Four Nations approach at the start, the joint working between the chief medical officers, all stuff that makes for less sensational evidence sessions at the inquiry. But if you look at, for example, the widely acknowledged work of the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which commanded the trust of the Scottish Government in building an information picture that the Scottish Government could draw on, I think that, I'm not trying to say that the COVID devolution arrangements worked particularly well, but so many of the state's crisis, there's a period of introspection from my former profession of the civil service in all sorts of aspects, including the devolved aspect, that we need to have a hard look at. There are anomalies in the devolution settlement, such as, was it really sensible to have Mark Drakeford expressing surprise that he was allowed to set his own international travel policy briefly? There are things that we should look at. It was such an extreme situation, but I don't think we should take a blanket dismissal of the cooperative approach that took place in multiple crises since devolution came into force.
Just quickly go back to the 2012 agreement, and colleague David had used the phrase gold standard. Gold standard has been used to describe that, but you also said, from a union's point of view, they should maybe have written in that there should not be another referendum for another 20 to 25 years. Do you really think that would have been a credible position, and how would that correlate with what was deemed a gold standard agreement if you're writing in Scottish, it doesn't matter how people vote in the future, there can't be another referendum for 20 to 25 years?
Well, as Mr. Ross said before he left, this is a long discussion, but I think that I would echo Professor Gallagher. We probably didn't do enough planning for a no vote. That was one idea. I actually think that now we're in the unhappy position, and actually it works better for unionists than it does for nationalists, but we're in the unhappy position, in my view, and Professor Gallagher, I think, takes a different view. Where the pursuit of independence is seen as entirely legitimate, but there appears to be no clear mechanism by which it can be attained, and I think that is a situation which could have become quite problematic in 2021. As it turned out, it didn't, but there is the potential for that to become a sore in British politics again in the future.
That's something you think needs to be addressed to reflect.
I would prefer that, but I don't see the political appetite for it.
Well, thank you both. Sorry to detain you a bit longer than we expected, Professor Barton, but thank you for your time today. And we knew that would be another informative exercise, a quick skip rounds 25 years of the Scotland Act. Right. And we managed to get there. We got some pretty good conclusions out of all that.
There was a year we missed out.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you both very much for attending. And order, order.